Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel where today we are doing a book discussion for The Bird King by Willow Wilson. So this is a book discussion and not a review because I did not finish this book. I made it about 170 pages before I gave up, but the reasons that I did DNF this are very specific to me and not applicable to most people. If you're curious as to why I DNF'd it, I will discuss it at the end of the video. But the reality is this is a really interesting premise with an interesting setting, and I do think that more people would be interested in reading this, and they're not going to have the same problems that I am. So I did want to go ahead and still discuss it. So let's talk about this book. First up, this is a young adult, I think. It's in that kind of liminal space between young adult and adult. Historical fantasy. It is set in 1491 in the last sultanate of the Iberian Peninsula. And we are following our main character of Fatima, who is a concubine for the sultan. And she is there when an envoy from the newly formed Spain arrives to discuss the terms of surrender with the sultan. And Fatima introduced one of the members of this envoy to her best friend Hassan. And Hassan is the palace map maker, but he also has the ability to make maps of places he's never seen and create doors that didn't exist before. And it turns out that the person that Fatima introduced to Hassan is part of the Spanish Inquisition, and so part of the terms of surrender is that Hassan is turned over to the Spanish Inquisition. Fatima gets word of this, and so she and Hassan end up fleeing the palace, and the story goes from there. So first up, let's talk about the world building. And I thought that this was interesting. Like I said, that's a very it's not a place that we normally get. We don't normally have things set in the Iberian Peninsula or that historical time period, right? Having things not only on the Iberian Peninsula, but before Spain has united the peninsula is very interesting because of the Moors that lived there with a very different type of culture than what ended up with Catholic Spain. So I do think that was really interesting. And so Willow Wilson kind of had her work cut out for her, as this is not a typical setting, so she kind of had to set the stage. And I think she did an okay job of it, but a little bit too late in the story for my comfort. So I felt like in the beginning I was kind of floundering because I don't really know much about the Iberian Peninsula, and especially in this last little area that we're talking about. And so it felt kind of desertish, but I don't actually know that it was desert, or maybe it was just scrublands. I don't actually know. And so while what we got was interesting, I don't necessarily think it was quite enough early on enough. Grammar. So I did struggle a little bit with that aspect of it, but where I stopped, I think that we were getting more as we went along, and it was very, very interesting. Obviously, there's also magic in this, and the magic system is not explained, at least not at the point that I stopped. We don't know why Hassan has these magical abilities, and it is not a normal part of this world. Nobody else that we know of has any magical abilities. And when I stopped, we were just starting to find out how and why Hassan would actually have this magic. But we don't really know the bounds of it. We don't really know what all he can do. I don't think he even knows, because he started experimenting a little bit with it. And I don't know if it's ever explained. There are magical creatures in this, which I thought was an interesting addition. But again, I didn't get to the point where any of it was explained as to why or how, so I don't know if it is ever explained. But I did think it was interesting. But this is another thing where I think it was not explained enough in the moment, because I didn't quite understand. It felt like they were legendary creatures from myths that I don't know, and so I didn't quite get it. So I'm not sure if this just isn't written for me or if it just needed more explanation. But Either way, I did think all the world building we got was interesting. I just don't think it was quite enough at the point where I stopped this story. So next up, let's talk about the characters. And our main character is Fatima. Like I said, she is a concubine for the Sultan. I'm not entirely certain how concubines generally work, but Fatima is also a slave. So she has absolutely no choice in the matter. And that is, she has feelings about that, as is pretty understandable. She is generally a very angry character, with good reason. As a side note, she, at the point where I left off, there were no sex scenes with the Sultan. So there is no on-page rape because Fatima does not consent to it, really. She doesn't have a choice. And at the point where I left off, there were no flashbacks either. But it is also very clear that we are kind of gearing up for Fatima to kind of start dealing with a lot of these suppressed feelings, and I don't know how exactly that's going to play out in the writing. However, what I saw from the author up until that point when we were dealing with Fatima's suppressed feelings was encouraging. Basically, like, there was a point where Fatima, for example, kind of lost it a little bit because they were traveling through this river and were trying to scrub off all of their scent to throw off the dogs. And then one of their companions basically said, okay, now get out of the water, strip down, and change your clothes. And she lost it. She was just like, nobody can tell me to take off my clothes ever again. And like, I liked that her companion, like how the companions were written, is that they very much are like, oh yeah, this is a thing. We need to be kind about it. And then they were. So I am encouraged by how that was written. So I don't know how it ends up playing out. It is clear that that's kind of where we're headed. This is a big thing. It's a very big content warning. So I wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit. So I don't know how it ends up playing out, but I am encouraged by what I have seen so far. But Fatima in general is very angry, but we don't get a lot about her other than that anger. We don't really get a lot of character development. I think that we're going to be getting a lot of character development, but 170 pages in, and I don't really know much about her. And honestly, the same can be said for Hassan. Hassan feels like a very naive kind of character, and that's all I really know about him. And so, like, I'm kind of left with this, I don't know who these characters are, but it feels like, again, we are gearing up to really, for them to have some really big growth. I just didn't get there yet. Now, their third companion for this trip, as they are fleeing the palace, is Vikram. And I can't really say too much about Vikram because we don't really meet him until partway through. But Vikram is not human, and he is a jerk. He doesn't try to be kind to the humans. He is there as a favor to somebody else, and he is helping them, but he's just a jerk. And the mix of Fatima's anger and Vikram's rudeness, meanness, it just didn't work for me. They hadn't settled into a group yet, and I think that they might. I just don't know when that's going to happen. So I didn't love any of our main characters at this point, and I am a little bit sad that I didn't get to see the growth that I can see we are headed towards. Yeah, the last person to talk about is Luz, and Luz is actually the person that is in the envoy that is part of the Spanish Inquisition, and it is also very clear that she becomes a much more prominent character. She is an antagonist in this, and she's the one that sets this whole thing off, that these two have to flee. But I don't know if she ends up going full villain or just stays an antagonist, or if maybe she has a change of heart and joins our little group. I have no idea. But she, apart from the fact that I'm really bothered by her intolerance, I do think that she is an interesting character, and I would have liked to get to know her better as well. So again, like, I feel like we spent so much time in the beginning setting up, but we didn't get enough of the correct kind of setup for either the world or the characters. but I can see where we're headed, and I did find that to be very interesting. Let's real quick talk about the plot, and it seemed fine. I didn't get much past the point of like, they're still in the very beginning stages of their journey. They've only been fleeing for a couple of days, so I have no idea. But it is very clear that the last 230 pages is going to be about this journey. I'm sure that they're going to run into obstacles. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of growth along the way. They're going to try to figure out where they can go, where they're not going to be tracked down. All of that is very clear. Like, that's what the plot is going to be. And I think that how the plot was handled up to this point is pretty good. Like, it took a little while to get to the point where they were fleeing, but I also think that there was a good amount of stuff that needed to be set up for the plot to really be understood as well. So I like that. And I think that, again, I was intrigued to see where it would end up going. So the last thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is the writing style, because the writing of the descriptions gets kind of purple, you guys. Like, it's amazing. And it's also a little bit jarring because the dialogue and the descriptions, or no, the dialogue and the action is not at all purple, but the descriptions are, and in a way that is extremely difficult to sometimes understand. And that actually is part of why the world building didn't work as well for me, is because a lot of the descriptions of like the landscape, for instance, was so difficult to understand. And I think this is something that a number of people will actually have issues with. Now, you don't have to understand all of the descriptions to still follow along with the book, but it is a little bit frustrating. So I wanted to mention that. So let's talk a little bit about what my particular problems were. And it's basically just that there are some very specific sentence structures that don't play well with my brain. And it's not even, like, it's very normal sentence structures. So what ended up happening is, once I realized this was a problem, I read a paragraph that I really struggled with, and then I handed my book off to my spouse. And I said, can you please read this and see if this is normal, like, or if this is just a me thing? And he read it and he was just fine. So it really is like very normal sentence structures that I literally, in the middle of the sentence, would realize that I was lost. Or I would read an entire paragraph and realize that my brain basically noped out of reading comprehension. So I had no idea what I had just read. And it is a very specific thing to this. Now, if you do occasionally have this problem where you get lost in the middle of normal sentences, or will read paragraphs with specific sentence structures and then realize you didn't pay attention to any of it, be careful with this book. It may not work for you, but most people will not have that problem. You guys, if you look at my 4 and 5-star reviews, almost all of them have very straightforward writing styles, and there's a reason for that. This just does, it's like my brain literally like just turned off. I felt so dumb reading this book because it was very clear that these sentences were not difficult. The vocabulary wasn't difficult. It wasn't metaphorical in any way. Like, it's just straightforward sentences that I just literally could not figure it out. And the reality is that, like, how I ended up doing it is I read the sentence multiple times, tried to figure out what it was saying, rearranged the words in my brain to create a new sentence that made sense to me, and then try to make that stick in my head. And I'm like, that is too much work. So I decided that, like, it was too much work and I just wasn't enjoying the actual process of reading the book. So I DNF'd it. But like I said, that's a very particular to me problem. And obviously, like, I did mention that there were a lot of things that were maybe not great, but that was all in the beginning. And it seemed like there was a lot of promise as to where we were headed, which is why I still feel comfortable saying, please give this a try if you think it sounds interesting. But that is all I have, you guys. Please comment down below if you have heard of this book, if you've read this book, and some of my guesses are correct. I would love to hear from you. Or if my guesses are incorrect, I would also love to hear from you. But that is all I have. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.